this is something that's new. We are using WebEx, so that's weird. I know. Thank you guys for being here and going through the weirdness. But WebEx is actually going to be embedded in Blackboard. So it'll just be on that menu on the left-hand side. If you've ever used Collaborate, if you used it last year, and I know you guys are all seniors, so you had classes for Wiregrass last year. If you ever used the Collaborate tool, which is their like virtual room, WebEx has one too. So we're going to get that on the menu side, and that's where we'll go to meetings from here on out. I think that'll work best. So, okay, so I know that if you've read this and you've already done the story of an hour, the main thing I want you to think about when we're talking about fiction is kind of like, especially starting with the plot. Now, there is nothing in the journals that says, give us the entire plot of a story. No. So I'm not going to be asking you so much to tell me, what's the plot, or I might ask you, why does somebody do something, or how does that happen? But the why and the how that's actually more meaningful than what. At the very basics, though, you do need to understand what's happening in a story. And for most of the stories we're going to cover, that's not going to be a problem. There might be a few where you're just at the end going, oh, what happened? And you might be mystified. In your journals, and this is something hopefully everybody will watch, and you can tell people if if other students are working on these things too and they're confused, it's okay to ask questions. It is okay to say, well, I thought that this happened, but then, well, then they described it this way. So what does that even mean? And it's okay to ask and say, I don't know something. What I don't want, though, is for, if you have 4 or 5 questions in your journal, is for 4 or 5 of the questions to be, I don't know, I don't know, I don't know. Even if 2 of them are, I don't know, well, give me some attempt. I'd rather you try to figure out the answer than that you just say, I don't know. Because in some ways you're not answering the question. So look at that section. If I say at the end of the story, blah, 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 this happens, what does that mean? And you don't know exactly what it means, but you can say, well, it sounds like this is happening. It's okay if you're wrong. You won't actually get points taken off. But if you don't attempt the answer, you will get points taken off. So, and it really depends. I understand sometimes you're pressed for time, and so you might give very brief answers, but more than anything else, what I would do is actually use the story to answer the question. So you can even, before you read a story, you can even read the questions, and then in some ways you're kind of knowing what you're going to look for. If you don't like spoilers, though, I would definitely not read the questions first. I would read the story first. I intentionally put the links in there so that you can look at the link and you can read the story before you even open up the questions. Because I want you to be able to just read the story. Some stories are longer than others. The longest story we're going to read in the fiction section is The Metamorphosis. And it's a very weird story, and yet it's really interesting. I find it interesting. It's not the happiest story ever, but I tried to mix in, gentler stories with, a few that are not so happy. But the main thing is that you really understand kind of what's going on in a particular story. That's going to help you the best on the test. The other things that I want you to look at are things like character. Who are these people? What do they, are there characters that really resonate with you, or characters that you dislike, and why do you dislike them? Usually, if you dislike a character, the author intended for you to they're intentionally the villain. And we have a few examples in like movies where the villain turns out to be the hero, or the villain is really the hero from the beginning. Like, I don't know, in Megamind, for instance. I love cartoons. So he's the villain, and he's put out to be the villain, and yet he's really the protagonist. He's the main character. He's the hero. In fiction, though, and in a lot of regular literature, the main character isn't necessarily the nicest person, but they're the ones that we identify with the most, and they're the ones whose actions and events and reactions and everything, matter the most to us. And so they're just and that's what we call them. And I'll put that word in there. So it's not really hero, it's protagonist. And it's not really villain, it's not that simplified. It's instead antagonist. So who's the person that they mostly are going against? And that's the antagonist. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. So the truth is you're not necessarily looking for who's the good guy and who's the bad guy, but who's the main person and who's less of, who's in the background. And if another character is specifically working against that main character, then that person's the antagonist. And so there are a few terms like that that you're going to have to understand. Now, we're reading prose. That just means it's in paragraph form, but we're reading fiction. Now, what's the difference between fiction and nonfiction? Can any of you write that in, or you can answer me if you want to unmute yourself? How are fiction and nonfiction different? Right. Now, fiction can be based on fact. So nonfiction is supposed to be like journalism and biographies and histories and things like that. Nonfiction is supposed to be real. And I say the word supposed to because very often, like if somebody makes an autobiography, they're writing the story of themselves. Very often, what they might even outright lie, but they're not supposed to. That if something is labeled as nonfiction, journalism is supposed to be factual. A lot of journalism is not, both on the on the television and in print and online. It's not necessary. Just because somebody puts it in in a newspaper doesn't make it fact. And very often newspapers have to retract certain stories or facts or something because they were not based in fact. Actually, they were just made up. A lot of people do that, actually. In fact, supposedly your resume is supposed to be fact. It's supposed to be nonfiction, and yet people fudge the reality. They say they worked somewhere longer than they did, or they lie about their education and what how many degrees they've obtained or whatever. And that, once that's found out, people, hey, you can't use fiction in a resume. It's supposed to be fact. But fiction very often is meant to resemble, especially modern fiction, is meant to resemble real life or comment upon real life. So it's just like movies. You've seen movies that are so unrealistic or so ridiculous. You're like, that even, I can't even go there. Like, it's too stupid. But most movies that you watch are essentially created to look like fact or resemble what our future could be, because we don't know what the future is going to be. We don't know what it's going to look like, what life is going to be like, but they are attempts to kind of show us what it could be. And often fiction is used to comment upon reality, but in a fictional world. Some authors actually had to use fiction to talk about their government or to talk about something like that, which if they had said the facts out, they would have been jailed for those facts. But if they put it in fiction, they can always say, well, it's just a story. And it actually preserves their, keeps them from having, being put in jail by a government that doesn't like them. So sometimes it's a way of getting around, the limitations that life has placed on us. Some of it too, a lot of writers have admitted to using it as therapy, where they talk about real events in their lives, but they fictionalize them and change the ending, or even it helps them explore why those things happened the way that they did. And so it's almost like, sitting on a couch and, explaining about your real life to a psychiatrist, only they write it down. And a lot of them do that. And some people say that truth is stranger than fiction. And so that weird things can happen in real life. So it seems like no one would believe it, that it happened. And yet it really did happen. It's something that if you put in a fictional story, no one would believe. They'd say, oh, well, that's just silly. That would never happen, when in reality it did. So it's all those types of things that I want you to think about. You know, fiction can use fact too. A lot of fiction writers start with a news story and they think, well, how fascinating. And then they go from that and they write a whole book that has that as one of its elements. So I know I really found it fascinating because I do write. I write novels mostly, but I also write plays and some really bad poetry. But there are times I've used, you know, a actually I went to a fort, a closed fort, but a fort in California, and it had been specifically created to separate Native American tribes from white settlers. And it was only 11, I think it was only in service like 11 years, and then it was closed again. And that's because so many of the Native Americans had been killed. And so I went through and I actually went through the old fort and they had all this historical stuff about it. And I I actually researched it so that I could end up using it in my story because I thought the facts of the matter were fascinating and I wanted to put them in. The story they're in is actually a fictional story, but it has facts in it. And so a lot of the stuff can get really jumbled. The truth is though, fiction has more freedom because it can resemble facts, but it doesn't have to be facts. And that's one reason I think I like it because you can play around with it. And do I read journalism as well? Do I read a lot of nonfiction? Yes. But when I'm just cozying up, you know, when it's raining out, storming outside like it was yesterday afternoon, and the wind's all blowing around and stuff, and it's too wet to go out and walk my dog, then I like to hang out on the couch and read. And what I choose to read mostly is fiction. So fiction often has a couple of different things that we're going to talk about. I already talked about plot. So that's, you know, just like the sequence of events, what happens in what order. Narrative is kind of how the story is told. So a narrative can actually be, you know, there can be a narrator, you know, an actual person talking, and it could be a character in the story that's telling the story, I did this and she did that. Or it could be just a narrator who's kind of outside. And we're going to talk more about those types of things. You know, how is the story told? What's the point of view and things like that? And what effect does it have? What I'd like for you to do is think about it when you are reading your own stuff. You know, when you're reading novels, you know, a lot of you said you really liked reading fantasy or sci-fi. Sci-fi very often is third person narration. So everybody is a person, but there's no character that tells the story from an I point of view. Most young adult literature is first person. So a character is telling the story from his or her point of view. There are some stories, I mean, novels, whole novels today that are written from multiple points of view. So each story, each chapter is like a different character talking. And so that's a possibility as well. It gets a little confusing as to who the protagonist is, though, when the story is told by a bunch of different people. But that's just my opinion. That's not how I would write a story. But I do like using first person. And so, but most of my writing is young adult. So it fits that genre. I also like writing in present tense. It took a while to get used to, but it's kind of it's what I like. I like the way that characters tell their story when it's in present tense. And we'll talk about things like that. But hopefully we'll get to actual analysis in these sessions on Thursday mornings. We'll get to analysis of the different stories. So once we've read a story and the journal is due, it's fair game. We can talk about it in here. Until the journal is due, we don't talk about it. Does that make sense? I hope that does. Because I want you to understand why we won't cover something until after the journal is turned in. Okay, the other stuff that happened, I don't know if you've ever watched a movie or you've read a book and you just go, nothing is happening and it's annoying, or you just don't care. Like you don't understand where this is even going, and you know, so what is really happening? And it just doesn't seem like much is at stake. We're just kind of just exploring a world, or, you know, this person's life is lame, but, you know, there's nothing really going on. Well, most of that happens because there's not enough conflict. And we're going to talk about a lot of these different things as we go through. There may be times, though, that we actually say, so what is the conflict in this story? Or what is the point of view that the author is using? And you guys can answer things like that. So we talked a little bit about point of view. You guys know what dialogue is, right? Dialogue. And I'll let you guys type it in. I can't see if you're typing, so Okay, so yes, you know what dialogue is, just the characters talking to each other. What's cool is when we get to the third genre that we're going to cover in this class is we're getting to drama. It's almost exclusively dialogue. It's just characters talking to each other. And often there's no, like they don't even describe them walking across a stage or doing it. It's just the dialogue itself. And you kind of have to interpret, well, what are they doing? And so, but that dialogue is important in stories as well as in sometimes there's even dialogue in the poetry we're going to cover, but there's absolutely a ton of dialogue in the drama part. So and I love dialogue. That's one reason I write a lot of dialogue in my YA books. And so, but I also write drama, so that makes sense. I would, you know, if you write plays, you have to really care about dialogue because it does matter. But so we're gonna go through things like Freytag's pyramid and stuff like that, which I'm actually gonna get to a point. It's in a very limited way right here. And it says this is the traditional shape of a story based on Greek drama, and that's where all this comes from. But let me just put in what this is called. It's an actual person and is well who wrote this out, and it's either IE or EI. I might have misspelled it, but this is Freytag's pyramid. And I don't have you ever seen this before? Have you ever seen that, like the where it starts out with exposition, where they're kind of explaining where we are, what time it is, who these characters are, and stuff like that? Okay, you have. Then see this little point, and I don't think I can. No, I can't draw on it. Can I draw on it? No, I don't. I think I can only highlight things. Yeah. Um, no, surely it says I can write. No, it's letting me write things. Okay, that's not gonna work. Darn. Um, oh, it's just if I can sign it. Well, that's really not helpful. Anyway, if you I gotta take this off. I can't take it off until I do that. If you go through this part right here, where it's first you have the introduction of character setting, that's exposition. And we talk about it, it's listed right up here on earlier on the page in bold. And then it gets to what we call an inciting incident. And that means stuff is going to happen now. And sometimes in a movie, an inciting incident will happen at the very beginning. Like you don't even you get kind of a scene with people doing something, and then all of a sudden somebody falls off a cliff and they're dead. And you're like, whoa, you know, we're all shocked. But that's the inciting incident, and that will put into play all the course of all the events that happen afterwards. And so, but there's that something that happens that makes it that starts the suspense happening and starts the rise in action. And so all this movement up the pyramid on this left side, because it's moving from left to right, all the movement up is essentially what they call rising action. And that just means that the conflict is being exposed and is rising. It's getting more and more suspenseful. Maybe there's a bomb that's about to go off, and oh no, we need to get out of here. You know, if you've ever seen the movie Speed with Keanu Reeves, you know, they set up what, you know, they're just on a bus. And all of a sudden, somebody calls and says the bus has to maintain, what I think it's 45 miles per hour. And if it slows down, the bomb's going to go off and the whole bus will explode. And if it stays, or if you call the police, then the bus will explode. If anybody tries to get on or off, the bus will explode. I mean, literally, it just keeps on setting this up. And then it gets, you know, they're trying to figure out a way to stop the person and get the bomb and blah blah blah, and they keep careening all around the city going 45 miles an hour. But it's rising and rising and getting more and more, you know, like fingernail biting. It's and that's what it's supposed to do, where more and more is at stake as we go through. And then at the very point where either somebody's got to make this choice or something's got to happen, or, you know, where essentially all of this rising action is leading to, it kind of, you know, blows up. Either it blows up, or it almost, you know, it's going to blow up. You see the countdown on the, you know, the little timer, and it's like 5, 4, 3, 2, you know, when the one and then the zero happens, that zero is that point of climax. It's that moment where there is no going back. And so, you know, it's sometimes hard to find in short fiction. So we're going to look for it as we go along, and we may disagree on where exactly the climax is, but we should agree on what the conflict is and how the action gets, starts rising up. So hopefully that will all work. After that climax part, then we have what's called falling action, and it's a lot smoother. Everything just kind of falls into place. All of the things that happen after the climax are in some ways inevitable. If the choice that the person makes in that climax is that choice, then all of the other things just kind of fall into place. And so it's falling action. Usually it's very much near the end of the story. It might actually even happen after the story. Like you understand the choice they've made, and that's the end of the story. Like they cut out some things for short fiction. But then at the very end, everything kind of gets tied up, and things get resolved. Whoever falls in love is going to fall in love. All this kind of stuff gets wrapped up. If it doesn't get wrapped up, if it's kind of like left open, that's really uncomfortable for a lot of people. I don't know if you've ever watched a movie where the outcome isn't entirely clear. And I'll intentionally use movies in this because so many of us have seen so many of the common movies. Like I love Inception. It's one of the smartest movies I've ever seen. And yet at the end, they don't tell us exactly, you're not sure exactly what state we're in. And so we've been given all these clues all the way through, but we're not sure. And in some ways, what you think the resolution is, the denouement, um, when you figure out what that is, and like my husband has an opinion and I have a different opinion, well, that says more about who you are than it says about the movie, because the movie really does make it so that it could go either way. But a lot of people don't like that. Do you guys like that? If the ending's open and you can just decide, they all live happily ever after or they all die, I don't like that. I tend to be very uncomfortable with an unresolved ending. And I don't know if you guys, you watch series, and I binge them, I'll do a series at a time. And I hate it when the end of a season is unresolved. And in fact, it's horrible. Like there's a horrible car crash. We don't know who was even in the car. And everybody's like, oh, and then the series ends. And I'm just like, what happens if, for instance, they're not renewed for a new season? We don't ever get the resolution. That's unsatisfying. So I will definitely, even if the story itself doesn't tell us what the ending is, we should be able to conjecture, for the most part, what the ending is, if that makes sense. Because you want the ending to be, at least understandable, or at least you want to know what it is, even if you don't love it. Has there ever been a movie that you watched that you hated the ending, or a series and you hated the ending of the series? I know that, like, Game of Thrones, tons of people were just so irritated by the end of they hated the way that it ended. Um, but I'm thinking about, like, even other movies. Sometimes somebody will, like Titanic. A lot of people were dissatisfied with that ending. So a lot of people were dissatisfied because it was based on fact, and so all these people died. My husband didn't like that. He's like, "Why did I watch this movie? It's so sad." So, but that part is based on reality. It's not. You can't mess around with those kinds of details because they really did happen. But if you ever have, I mean, and you can tell me in the journals too, if you have an issue with um, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing for a second. I'll come back to this, but I'm going to share something else for a second. Mm-hmm. Not that one. Do, 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 do. Okay. Can you see, do you see the Blackboard? I know it's huge and there's tons of classes, but don't get freaked out. Okay. Oh, and it's popping up little things. Okay. So you can see Blackboard. I just wanted to make sure you could see it. Okay, so I'm going to go just show you really quick so that you kind of know, and I can walk you through it and say I've actually walked you through it. I'm just going to go into one of the journals. We'll do one that we'll start with the story of an hour. And I'm just going to use some of those questions. And what I'll do is I'll go back and forth between the OER textbook and this. So, and we'll just kind of go through, and I'll try to cover these questions every time we talk about a story. But how many of you had read this before? Have read a story of an hour before? Okay, you had. Okay, I'm going to switch over and share something different. Okay, so you've read, had anybody not? So I wanted it to be one that's familiar, plus it's in the chapter anyway. So this is one that's very typically talked about because the events in it are actually pretty clear, but what they mean might not be so clear. And that's, it's actually, some of it is based on the actual author. Kate Chopin was kind of an upper class woman living near New Orleans, and she was married, but her husband passed away when she was quite young. She had kids, but from that point on, she was a widow, and she never remarried. And I don't think they had an unhappy relationship, but I think she was not necessarily um, like she knew, I guess she realized anyway that there were very strict rules about her behavior, about what their marriage was and wasn't, what kind of power she had in her marriage. You know, he kind of made all the choices. She also had a very limited role socially. You know, at that time, women, especially upper class women, you know, they couldn't have a job. The only time they went outside the house is to, you know, go and socialize with other women and do very, you know, it's not a world that we're really used to. You know, probably some of you guys have jobs after school. I know I had jobs. I had jobs all the way through college. Sometimes I worked two part-time jobs, you know, and I work now. Well, if I were a part of her society, I would not be teaching you. I would be at home, you know, tending to house duties and taking care of my children if I had any. But my kids are growing up now, so I did have some. But for the most part, it was you know, she lived a very traditional household until her husband died. And then from that point on, she never remarried. And she wrote a lot of literature that was very much from a woman's point of view, and certainly looking at the limitations that women had to deal with. So there's something to keep in mind. Now, does it mean that this is about her? No, it's not. This is absolutely not. This is a fictional story, and at no point, even with poetry, can we assume that the poet who is the one who's speaking in the poem. So this is not about her, but there are themes in it that come through from her life. So she is writing somewhat from experience. Now, what happens at the very beginning? I mean, we have from the very beginning the inciting incident, right? So we don't get any backstory, what they're, you know, from the beginning. We don't have exposition that says this is what their marriage was like and how many children they might have or where they lived or nothing. We just have Mrs. Mallard. We have two things that we know. Mrs. Mallard was afflicted with a heart trouble, and people had to tell her about her husband's death. So her husband had died, and she had a heart trouble. So she had a weak heart, and lots of stress could mess with it. So who told her? Two people. Her sister Josephine, and then her husband's friend Richards. And we don't know how he knew her. He was in the newspaper office when the disaster was, you know, when the news was reported, and he saw Brantley Mallard's name on the list of deceased, okay, well, killed in this story. So he was at the newspaper office, came over to her house probably, and told Josephine first and said, we got to tell her that her husband died on the train today. And so they tell her. So he just wanted to make sure. He actually even sent a second telegram to make sure that it was true. And then he went over to their house and told Josephine. So then Josephine and Richards together tell Mrs. Mallard, right? And how does she respond? And you can tell me. Yes, she cried almost instantly, which is actually, this is me. This is how I respond to grief. I mean, instant crying. So she wept at once with sudden wild abandonment. And so she was at first really, I mean, it was devastating. And so and later on, they're even going to talk about the fact, yeah, you guys are actually, it's all good. And then when the storm of grief had spent itself, she went away to her room alone. And this is a scary time. A lot of people, this is when they do things like hurt themselves, or they can take drastic actions. So the sister's not, she's a little freaked out about it, because the wife goes upstairs, goes to her room and shuts the door, and no one, she doesn't want to, I don't want anybody with me, I just want to be alone. That's, especially with grieving, especially over time, being alone is actually, it can hurt to just mull over it too long, you know so they think, as they're standing outside the door, Josephine thinks, oh no, she's going to hurt herself, or she's this is not good. She's worried about what her sister is going to do. And so, so she actually goes into a room and sits in an armchair, and she's physically exhausted, and she feels like drained. And then she's looking out into, through the window. She's looking, and she can smell the rain in the air. She can hear noises from the street and things like that. And it seems to calm her down, which honestly nature often does to people. But then we get to this thing finally, and it even says sometimes there will be a sob. So had been sobbing. You know how kids do that thing where they go, and even though they had stopped crying like 5 minutes before, it still kind of comes out a little bit. And so she sometimes does that, and even compares it to a kid who like fell asleep crying or something. But then, it's just kind of going through and describing her a little bit. And then it says there was something coming to her and she was waiting for it fearfully. What was it? So there's some thought that's about to enter her mind. And it's like she can, almost like, you can pick out a word, but it's just not at the tip of your tongue, and it's not there. You can't put it into words. But she felt it creeping out of the sky, reaching toward her through the sound, the scents, the color that filled the air. And it says she recognized what this thing was, what this feeling or idea or thought was, and she was trying to beat it back. Like, no, I'm not going to think about that. And then finally she abandoned herself to it. So, and she says, free, free, free. Now, what does that mean when she goes, free? Yeah. Now, and it's free. You think, what? And certainly from our point of view in the modern age, we'd be shocked. Like, what? It's not like he was, had her strapped to, a doorway or something all day so she can't escape. She's not in jail. And was he mean? And this is the question, the first thing we think, was he an abusive husband? And it just says, she says free, and then she says she didn't stop to ask if it were or were not a monstrous joy. Like she shouldn't be thinking about it. She shouldn't be happy. But essentially, she said she knew she'd weep again when she saw the kind, tender hands folded in death. He's a nice guy. It's not because her husband is abusive. The face that had never looked save with love upon her, fixed, gray, and dead. But she saw beyond that moment, actually burying her husband and mourning him. She saw beyond that moment to happiness and freedom. And it would be a freedom where she could choose what she did. She would live for herself. There would be no powerful will bending hers. And it says, in that blind persistence with which men and women believe they have a right to impose a private will upon a fellow creature. And, no one would be trying to manipulate her into being something she isn't. A kind intention, whether he intended well or he cruelly intended something, doesn't really make a difference. He still controlled what she did and what she chose to do with her life. And it even says, and yet she loved him sometimes. Probably, like Kate Chopin's marriage, her marriage was arranged. So it was a matter of station. Parents kind of talked to each other. I think so. My son should marry your daughter. And then they got married. But it was, upper class weddings were very rarely about, oh, I've fallen in love with somebody, especially for the woman. And very often people couldn't pick. Even the men often couldn't pick. They were just told by their parents, hey, you're going to get married. But it says she had loved him sometimes. But does love make up for the fact that you didn't have any freedom? And then Josephine, who can't understand what she can't hear her or doesn't know what she's doing, she's like, what are you doing, Louise? For heaven's sake, open the door. And Louise, right, so this is Mrs., Mrs. What's her name? Why can I not remember her name all of a sudden? Mallard. Oh my goodness gracious. I can't believe I couldn't remember that. So, but she says, what are you doing? Louise Mallard says, I'm not making myself ill. She's just happy. And she says, what's so funny too is she says he's a good dude. So he was nice. He always looked with the, at her with love. He was always kind and gentle. And yet she still feels free. At least she's not going to be controlled anymore. So he didn't even, I'm sure he didn't even realize how much he was trying to control her. I don't think she realized necessarily how much she was being controlled until the leash was off and the collar was taken off. And then she just said, wait, I can run and I can do anything I want. So she arose at length and opened the door. Now at the end, there's Richards at the bottom of the staircase. But who comes in the front door? As she's walking down the staircase. In triumph. Yes, her husband wasn't dead. He wasn't on the train. He didn't die, even though he was on that list. He didn't even know there'd been an accident. And so he's just coming home from work like, hey, honey, I'm home. And Josephine, the sister, screams. Richards tries to cover up the fact that he exists. But Louise Mallard is dead. Her heart gives out. Now, the doctors at the end, this is intended irony. So it says something, and yet we know as readers that the opposite is true. So it says, when the doctors came, they said she had died of heart disease, of the joy that kills. But what joy did she really, what joy was killed? She had joy in the idea of being free, and his existence, the fact that he wasn't dead, makes her yeah, I don't know that she's joyful that her husband's gone, but she's definitely joyful to be free of his control. Now, in relationships today, this is a very different world. They even joke, and my mom and dad were always joking about who wore the pants in the family, because my mom really controlled much. She was head of the household, even if dad, was the major breadwinner. And she kind of dictated the rules of the house, and he just kind of went along with it. But that was not typical of my dad and mom's generation. They're boomers. And typically what happens, even with your grandparents, is that it's much more, the dad's kind of in charge, and the mom just kind of, does other things. So traditionally, even then, there's a traditionally different role. What about today with relationships now with you guys? Are relationships typically, where the guy's in charge and the girl just goes along with whatever? Or is it, more even, where the woman can she gets to pick. I mean, it used to be, oh, you say absolutely not. Oh, so that's good. Okay, so it used to be that, a woman couldn't even necessarily go to college. Now that's very different. It was rare that a woman had a job unless she was working in her husband's shop or something. It was rare that she had unless she was a servant. She could be a maid or a housekeeper or something. But very often those people weren't even married. They just they didn't get married. Many of them weren't allowed to be. A school teacher even, a woman could be a school teacher. She could not be a married school teacher. Maybe the turn of the century, a little bit after when this book, this story was published in 1894. So even 1910 or so, women who were teachers had to be unmarried. Once they got married, they needed to retire. They couldn't be teachers anymore. That was just rules. But today, you can be married, you can have children, you can have a full-time job, right? And I do. So when my kids were really little, I mostly stayed home. I worked part-time or I taught online. But for the most part, I've been full-time teacher. I've been teaching for 30 years. So I've been teaching a lot of times when my kids were alive. And, once they went back to school, it was really easy to go back to work and work full-time. But that's very typical. At that time, it was not. Even among my parents' generation, many women never worked, not once. They didn't have a job for even a year or something. Or if they worked before they got married, and then they quit their jobs once they got married, and they never worked again. So again, it shows somewhat the difference. Today too, we have what's called divorce, right? Or if a lot of us date a long time, and so we pick out our own partners. My parents didn't choose my husband for me. I picked him. But I dated him for all the way through college. And so at any point I could have said, nah, I don't want to get married to you. And we wouldn't have gotten married. And even if after we get married, we have laws in the books that allow people to get divorced. And so in today's world, would this have happened? What would Mrs. Mallard's options be? First of all, would she have married Brantley Mallard at all in the first place? That's a good question. Probably not, because she wouldn't have picked him out. She would have picked somebody else. But if she did get married to him and she really didn't love him and she didn't really, and he tried to control her, she'd divorce him. Unless he was, maniacal. But even then, we have women's shelters for that, right? If some man is so controlling and abusive, a woman can actually go to a shelter and get protection while she files for divorce and gets custody and things like that. So we have laws in place to help people who are in situations like this where they feel trapped. But again, he's not a bad dude. And you don't have to divorce somebody for a real reason. You don't have to say, oh, well, that person's abusive or they hit me, or, there doesn't have to be that kind of, you can just say irreconcilable differences or whatever. There are a lot of different reasons you can get a divorce. And there can be no fault divorces, that in most states anyway have those. So she can just say, look, I'm just not into you and I shouldn't have gotten married to you in the first place, and then get divorced. At this time, though, there was no such thing. A woman, my grandmother actually got a divorce, but she had to go to court to do it. And it was only because he had been absent for 3 years. He just had this wandering thing he did. And so he kept disappearing on her. And finally, she started filing, she'd waited for him for 2 years. He hadn't returned. And they'd been married, I don't know, only maybe 5, 6 years. But she waited 2 years. He disappeared that whole time. She still has no idea if he ever, if something happened to him. But she filed for divorce, and it took a good year for it to happen. And there were people who wouldn't speak to her after she got divorced because they were just, to them, it was immoral, that this is not something that you did. And yet she had to prove cause too. Well, he's been absent. I haven't seen him in 2 years. And she had to prove that in court and prove that she was paying her own bills and that there was nothing, he wasn't sending her money or anything like that. And so she was granted a divorce, married my grandfather, and had my mom. So, but see, that was one of those rare things. So, it was not typical. Today, do people get divorced? Yeah. Do they all get divorced over and over again? No, a lot of us stay married. I mean, I've been married over 30 years now. I have no intention of divorcing. So that kind of stuff. We still have happily married people, but we get married for different reasons today too. We don't have the upper class, oh, let's arrange all our marriages together and stuff. So life's different, and that's probably a really good thing, in my opinion. Okay, so let me go ahead and stop sharing. Let's share a different thing. Browser. We're going to go. So if we look at the questions of Story of an Hour, I'm just going to move this over. I'll just make it bigger too, because I like doing that. That way you can see it better. So what most shocked you? Was it a shock, I guess? And you think about since all of you have read this before, was this a shock that she died? The first time you read it, were you surprised at the end? Because I sure was. Yeah, you were too? Okay, good. Because I went, what? It took me, I had to go back and go, what happened? Because I heard that, the sister screamed and Richards tried to cover up the husband, but it took me a minute to go, wait a second, what happened? And I went back and I had to go, okay, what, she died? And then I had to go through and kind of read the whole, I mean, it's a short story, very, very short story. So I could go through. Now, what do you think of Mrs. Mallard? This is your opinion. There's no wrong or right answer. I've had readers very angry with her, thinking that she was really beastly to go, yay, I'm free, when her husband had just died, and that she got what she deserved. That's probably as extreme as I've felt. I've had people say. But it could be, it's just like, I understand how she feels. And that's okay. It's okay if you say, well, I get it. I don't think I'd feel that way. I certainly won't. And I think she is a caring person. And certainly the fact that Richards cares about how she's going to take the news, and her sister's there, and she cares very much about what happens, how her sister's doing, and making sure she's not hurting herself or making herself sick or anything like that. She has friends, but in some ways I'm really sad that that's how it ended. You wish that she could sit down with her husband and go, okay, I've had this epiphany, and we need to talk, and we need to make this marriage more equal, because I feel stifled and trapped. And you're a wonderful dude, but you keep trying to control what I'm doing, and you need to stop. And the truth is, even in marriage, you have to sit there and go, sometimes you have to tell the other person, hey, dude, you're doing this and I don't like it, But the fact that she felt like she couldn't even tell her husband that's sad. And so with those questions, a lot of them, I notice how it all says, why do you think this? Or how do you feel? Or what do it's all about you. And I want to know your personal reaction. Make sure though, it's like I have those 3 questions. If there's at any point, if you have some things that are lingering questions, like for a story that you haven't already talked about before, feel free to ask questions. Even at the end, you can say, look, the end confuses me. So what exactly happened? And you can say that. You can say, I don't even know what happened. I don't get that. And then I can help you. I will write you back. I haven't graded those yet, but I will actually write you back. And I'll go, okay, this is what happened and this is what it means, and blah, blah, blah. And I'll give you some help. So tell me if you don't get something, and be open, because if you're not willing to say that something's confusing, other people won't. Now we're going to have to stop because it's 9 o'clock, but you kind of see what I'm asking you to do. I will give you feedback though, both on the Story of an Hour and the Blind Men and the Elephant. You'll get that by Monday morning. Story of an Hour, I'm going to look at today, but the Blind Men and the Elephant is due, I think, tonight. Is it tonight? Or was it last week? Maybe it was last week. But keep reading. If you don't understand a story, it's okay. Do your best to answer the questions, and then ask me questions. Ask, and ask. And don't be afraid. Oh no, she's going to not like that I asked. No, I want you to ask. I promise. I absolutely want you to ask. I really desperately need, and in fact, if you don't ask, then then we're going to be in trouble. Because if you don't ask and nobody else asks, I'm going to assume you guys all get it. And maybe I won't catch from your answers that you don't, and so I won't clarify something. So does that make sense? I want you to make sure, don't be afraid to ask. There's no stupid question in this class, okay? I know there are teachers who are like, there's no stupid question, and then you ask a question, you go, well, that's a stupid question. No, there really are none. I will repeat something, even if I already told you about it. I will happily repeat it for you, okay? Thank you for coming. Thank you, all of you, for coming. I think even by the end, I still had 5. How many people do I have? Alyssa, Andrea, Haley, Kishay, Rachel, Rebecca. So it's an all-girl team, man. At least at this point. We'll see if we get any guys in here. Actually, I think the vast majority of y'all are women anyway. But thank you, thank you, thank you for coming. I will absolutely pay attention to who's here. So, but it's not required. I just want you to be in, if a few of you can show up, then we can have a good time. Okay. Have a great day. Hope I don't make you late for school, and I'll talk to you guys later. See ya.